Hello, welcome to my little presentation on color management. And I want to spend some time talking about monitor calibration, about printer profiling, and about a number of physical things that you can do at home to improve your color output. So let's start by talking about color management and why we need it. And the simple fact is, if you don't share your images with anybody at all, you don't need it, because if you're opening images on your monitor and you're taking them into Affinity Photo or into Photoshop or something like that to create the best colors, those are the colors that you'll always see when you open them on your monitor. However, this potentially falls apart when you pass that file on to somebody else whose monitor might not be calibrated in exactly the same way that yours is. And so subsequently on somebody else's monitor, your images might look a bit light or a bit dark or a bit less saturated. And that is what color management is all about, consistency. So it's about, in an ideal world, it's about everybody having their monitors and their printers set up in exactly the same way, so that whatever work you produce, whoever you pass it to, whether it be an amateur sitting in front of an iMac or a high-end professional printing laboratory, everything will look identical. And I need to talk a little bit about me, I suppose, and why it was important for me. So initially, in the wonderful days of shooting negatives, we'd pack our films, little rolls of film, off to the laboratory. The lab would process the film and they would make prints and they would make professional judgments on what those colors should look like. And generally they'd do a really, really good job. And certainly in the case of professional labs, it cost a lot of money because, you know, there were high-end professionals involved in making those decisions. The moment that the world switched to digital rather than film output, the labs kind of held their hands up and said, do you know what? We don't need to worry about this anymore, because it's the photographer's problem. It's the photographer's job to make sure that their colors look fantastic. And it's the photographer's job to ensure that the files we receive match our printing equipment, which of course it didn't. I don't know if I speak for everybody, but certainly on a personal level, I was never satisfied with the quality of the output the labs were producing, even high-end labs, until I bought my own printer, which is this big boy sitting next to me. And the moment that I bought my own printer, and the moment that I calibrated my printer so that the print output matched what I was seeing on my monitor, everything changed, because everything looks exactly the way I would wish it to look. And now in theatre, colour's really important. Most of you know I'm a theatre photographer, but colour's really important. You know, if a theatre's doing panto, they want really, really rich, vibrant colours. If they're doing a straight play, the set designer or the costume designer wants to see a proper reflection of all of the hard work that they put into producing the costumes and set and stuff, and they want it to look as much like the real thing as possible, and all of this process makes all of that so much easier. So let's talk a little bit about how it actually works. And bear with me for a moment, I'm just going to share my screen. So what is color management and why do we need it? So the answer is this. Now, if we look at this image, pile of paint tins, we could probably just about get by describing the colors in this image to somebody. We've got the pillar box red, we've got the grass green, etc., etc. We've got the sky blue. But how on earth do you get by describing the difference between the tones of these mugs? There's about 80 separate images on this screen. and every single one of them is a different color to its neighbor? And the answer is, of course, that you can't, because it's just impossible. So in the 1930s, initially, some scientists got together. They called themselves the International Commission on Illumination, and they worked out a way to describe color mathematically. It's using the principle that the human eye uses red, green, and blue to process color. And they basically designed a color space, if you like, and we'll have a look at what that means shortly. They found a means of describing color in terms of mathematical value for both the red, the green, and the blue channels. So in other words, a particular color might have X value of red, Y value of green, and Z value of blue. And once those numbers have been established, you can share that information across media. So in other words, between my monitor and my printer, and say to the other equipment, the printer in this case, so these are the colors that this is supposed to be, so you need to make it so. So that's in very basic terms, that's how color printing management works. So let's just move on a slide. And you can really see the problem here. So this is a little shot that I took in Hughes a few years ago. And you can see that all of these televisions are displaying slightly different colors, making it impossible for anybody to make an educated purchase, because how could you possibly base any decision on the quality of these different outputs? I have no idea which of these is the best monitor, and I suspect that ultimately everybody just ends up the one that has the colors that most pleases them, which isn't entirely satisfactory. And I'm pleased to say that that situation has improved no end in the last 5-10 years. So here it is. The dictionary says, in digital imaging systems, color management is the controlled conversion between the color representations of various devices such as scanners, cameras, monitors, TV screens, printers, pressers, and corresponding media, which is a bit of a headful to take on board, but you can forget about it instantly, because you can cross it all out and replace it with one word, and that is consistency. So I talked about color spaces a few minutes ago, and here we can see a visual representation of just such a color space. So it's basically viewed from above a horseshoe shape, and as this thing slowly revolves, you can see that it contains every imaginable color and every imaginable tone of every imaginable color. So if we just tip it up a bit and have a look at the bottom, you can see that they get darker and darker and darker towards the bottom, where finally they become black. And then if we roll this image upwards, you can see the reverse is true at the top. The very top point is white, and of course that's where all the lighter and lighter and progressively lighter tones sit. Now, before we move on, let's just talk about the environment in which we are working. I'm calling it the digital darkroom because that's basically what it is. It's replaced a traditional darkroom where I and many of my colleagues spent hideous hours slaving away in near pitch black. So much easier these days. And so what conditions are perfect conditions for judging color? First of all, we need to keep the lights dimmed. You want as little interference as possible while you're working. So the less light bouncing around in the room, the better. To that end, if you have blinds, close them. If you have curtains, close them. Don't paint the walls a really daft color. Use neutral colors, because, for example, if your walls are pillar box red, some of that color is going to bounce off you onto the monitor screen and may well affect your decisions when it comes to making color changes. For the same reason, don't wear bright clothing. If you wear a pillar box red sweater, that pillar box red sweater is likely to be reflected even partially on screen and could make making judgment very difficult where color is concerned. Choose a neutral desktop wallpaper. Talk again about this in a moment, but just bear in mind that if you have, and I've seen many of these, if you have desktop wallpaper that is covered in bright colors, they will affect the way that you see a color image the moment you open it, and I'll prove this shortly. Finally, if you have one or if you have access to one, use a monitor hood, because that will separate the monitor from the surrounding colors, whether it be wall or whatever equipment on your desk, but well worth investing in one if you're able to. So let's talk a little about what you can do to make sure that your prints stay looking as good as the images that you see on your monitor. Just like everything else in life, you get what you pay for, and it really is worth investing in quality paper if you want your images to last. And there are 4 things we need to talk about here. First of all, avoid paper that contains acid. This sounds ridiculous, but manufacturers put acid into paper because it makes them look really white, which looks great. But of course, acid ultimately will damage the paper and it won't last anywhere near as long as it would were there none present. Also, the same applies with optical brighteners. Optical brighteners are found in things like washing powder because they make whites whiter than white. All very lovely, and you know, when you use your Persil, your white shirt comes out looking fantastic. But unfortunately, just like acid, optical brighteners don't last. They will reduce in strength over time, and that will definitely damage the appearance of images on your paper. Now, lignin is an interesting one. Lignin is a product, a natural product that occurs in cellulose, which is a plant product that features in paper. And it's lignin that makes paper turn this dreadful sort of rusty coppery color that you can see in this image. And if you buy premium paper, all of the lignin will have been removed, so there's no chance of that happening. And finally, avoid cheap inks. You know, Epson brand name, Canon brand name, maybe 2 or 3 times more expensive than the cheap stuff, but they are guaranteed to last. They carry very long guarantees. So if you're using decent paper and decent inks, there's no reason at all why a print shouldn't last 50 years, and I'm pretty certain will outlive a typical photographic print. So let's talk about desktops. If you've got a desktop that looks something like this, and this is a huge exaggeration, I know, but if you have a desktop that looks like this, you deserve what you get, because, you know, if you sit staring at this madness all day long, when you start to edit any color images, this will have impacted on your eyesight and will make a difference to what you're actually seeing on screen. I've seen any number of desktops that are covered in really beautiful but very colorful photographs, and you're much better off sticking with a very dull neutral gray desktop, because that way your eyes are always ready to see properly, as it were. And just to give you an illustration of what impact bright colors can have, if you just stare at this image for a moment, you can see it's covered in lots of dots that all appear to be different colors. Well, they're not. They're all exactly the same color. And if you focus on one dot only, you'll see as you move from one to the next that actually they are the same color. It's just that when you take the image in as a whole, it's extremely difficult to see, and it's a really good reason for being very careful about being surrounded by lots and lots of color. So here's another example. These 2 X's are actually exactly the same color. It's really difficult to believe, but the one on the left appears to be much lighter than the one on the right. But that's because it's being affected by the bright color background. And if I just remove the little tab center bottom, you can see that there's no difference in those tones at all. So here's the most extraordinary one perhaps of all, and I'm constantly astonished by this image, because in this image, the square towards the top of the screen, which is labeled A, is actually exactly the same color as the square labeled B beneath it. And my brain certainly can't read that. I've seen this 100 times, and B always looks infinitely lighter than A. Just to prove that this isn't a trick, I'm just going to exit for a moment and jump out of Keynote and open the image in Photoshop. Now, I've chosen my brush. I'm just going to sample the color of box A, which you can see down here. And now I'm just going to paint. And there you have it. There's no difference. They are exactly the same. And yet, try telling your brain that. Absolutely mad. Let's go back to Keynote. So here's another example, a very similar thing, but in color this time. And the bright orange square on the left face of this giant Rubik's Cube is actually exactly the same color as the brown one on top of it. So let's have a little look at the hardware involved in calibrating a monitor and profiling a printer. They're completely separate devices, and the one that we're going to look at today is called a colorimeter. Typically will probably cost you around £100. And it's a small box that looks like this, and I'll illustrate how it works in just a moment. So the important thing here is a colorimeter measures transmitted light. In other words, it's designed specifically and only to read monitors. So you wouldn't be able to use this to set up a printer, for example, because it will only read transmitted light. And here are suggested monitor settings, which we'll come back to at the end of this little presentation in a moment. So best to set these manually once you've bought a colorimeter. A white point of 6500K, which is also called D65, which basically equates to daylight. A gamma of 2.2, which is exactly the same for PCs and Macs. A luminosity value, in other words, a brightness value of 120 candelas. Now, this is really important because some devices, when they're delivered, iMacs were a great example. I don't know about modern iMacs, but certainly going back a few years, iMacs were delivered with a typical luminosity value of 300 candelas. So they were really, really bright, and they looked absolutely fantastic. But the trouble is that when users opened their images at 300 candelas, they thought they looked too bright, so they darkened them. And we're back to that situation I was talking about earlier, where having darkened that image, you then send it to somebody else whose monitor is actually set to 120 candelas. And of course, it looks really dark and miserable because previously it was great. It was just that the monitor was too bright. So if you do have an overbright monitor, try 120 candelas. It's the recommended range for viewing images to be sent to the printer lie between 120 and about 90 candelas. So you can play with that value, but 120 seems to be a good setting to start with. ICC versions, well, version 4 profile is the one to go for because it's the most modern. And if there's a setting for a contrast ratio, set it to native if this option exists. Better monitors have greater shadow detail, and so if you just set it to the native setting, it will provide the best quality contrast that your particular monitor is capable of. So this is how it works. So here's my laptop, and you can see next to the laptop is my colorimeter. I've opened i1 Profiler, which is the software for this particular device, and I'm just setting it to run. Now, throughout the whole process, the software tells you exactly what you need to do and when you need to do it. So it's extremely easy to use. I've just removed the lid from the colorimeter so that it's open and ready for use, and I'm being instructed to place it in the middle of my monitor screen, which I'm doing now. And then we'll press proceed. The first thing that will happen in the case of a MacBook Pro is that it will set the brightness, and it will take a few readings and then ask you to adjust the brightness manually until the brightness value rests within the green stretch. As you can, I've just hit the top of it, as you can see in the top left. The rest will actually be done by the software. So as we advance now, it will move through a long series of different colors. And in each case, what is happening is that the colorimeter is recording the color in its RG and B values, and it's comparing that to an LUT, a lookup table, to see how it compares. So it may be exactly the same, which would be fantastic. But if it isn't, what it will subsequently create is a lookup table for this particular MacBook Pro that will say, for example, if this color blue turns up, you need to change it but incrementally by this value in order to make it match the color that it should be. And this is all done completely automatically, so nothing to be even remotely concerned about. So this process takes about, I suppose, 4 or 5 minutes. Where are we? I'm just going to advance it a bit. Okay, so it's finished, the readings. It's now instructing me to remove the device and close it. And the next thing we'll do is press the advance key, okay that, and move on to the final stage where we give the ICC profile a name. And when we've done that, it will be installed, not just installed, but it will be installed and will become immediately active on the MacBook Pro. And the software provides a bunch of pictures so that you can just look at befores and afters just to see if there is any difference. And in the particular case here, you can see that the image is somewhat cooler. After. And that's it. The job is finished. So it's really easy. So just to finish off, let's go back to these suggested monitor settings. Really easy to set up. No reason why everybody really shouldn't be using some sort of calibration with their monitor, because if we all did, all of our images would look fantastic. So white point 6500K, gamma 2.2, LCD luminosity 120 candelas, version 4 ICC profile, and contrast ratio set to native. And that concludes the first of these 2 little videos.